Hello, my name is Joseph Darren and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Cape Town in the Climate System Analysis Group. In this presentation I'll be sharing results from an online survey looking at how we visualise climate information. And if you're looking at this presentation on YouTube, then make sure you choose a high quality setting so that you can see the visualisations clearly. Nearly all climate scientists and people involved in climate change research will at some point create visualisations to try and communicate their data and results. And this is why we're interested in this issue, and particularly how we can best visualise climate data to inform the vulnerability, impacts and adaptation communities. And the two focused research questions that we're asking in this particular study were: how do alternative visualisations of climate data affect a user's ability to understand and interpret the information? And how does the choice of information content from historical observations and future climate projection data affect a user's ability to understand uncertainty and assess climate risk? And these issues of visualization type and also the choice of information content, which I'll explain further later, are really what's driving the questions and the method that we're employing in this survey. So we developed an online survey to gather data around how people interpret different visualizations of climate information. We did this with the help of Susie Lorenz from the University of Leeds, who is studying this particular topic in her PhD. The survey was targeted at the African adaptation and impacts community, and we circulated the URL for the online survey to a number of email lists, including the email list for the Climate Information Platform, which is hosted by CSAG at University of Cape Town. Within the survey, there was a sampling method, such that when people went on the survey, they had to click on a particular icon. And if you did the survey, you'll remember this slightly strange question. You had to look at the picture and identify whether it was a tree, car, house, or light bulb. And this put you into a different stream. So if you answered tree or car, then you went into stream 1. And here we were giving people information or visualizations that had minimum and maximum rainfall information in. And the people who were in stream 2, who answered house or light bulb, were given different information, 10th and 90th percentile information. We also varied visualizations between these groups so we could compare how people responded across these two streams. Within each stream, we also subdivided further, such that some people were given an example of population distribution in South Africa to demonstrate what the 10th and 90th percentiles look like for a distribution that's heavy-tailed, and others were not given this information. And interestingly, we found that this actually had very little effect on the interpretation of climate information, but we'll discuss this later in the presentation. So just a quick word on those who responded to the survey. We had 272 complete responses, and of those 272 complete responses, the majority focused their work on Africa, but we also collected other demographic information including age and gender, self-assessed numeracy, also reasons for using climate information, and we had quite a diverse spread of uses, from university research to government planning to consultancy and resource management. I haven't got time to go into all of this information, but if you're interested, do contact me at the end. I'll put my email address at the end so you can contact me about that. So let's take a look at some of the results from the survey. So before I look at the results in terms of the data that was captured, I want to just give you the qualitative messages that come out of this survey. And the first result that we have is that people interpret the same graph differently. And the second result is that information content affects the assessment of how likely it is to exceed specific thresholds. And this is a specific result relating to the observation data that was captured. And here the information content I'll describe with the help of the visualizations in a second. But here we're not talking about the type or the style of the visualization, but the actual data that's communicated, or the data that's synthesized and then communicated through the visualization. So this was one of the questions that was asked during the survey. How likely will it be for the rainfall in April 2014 to be more than 500 millimeters? Now, at the time of answering the survey, it was September 2013 or October, so April was more than April was in the distant future. So really, people were just relying on the information that was captured in these visualizations. And if you look at the visualization on the left, so this is what stream 1 had. They had the minimum to maximum information, which is given in those light blue bars, and then the dark blue gives you the mean for each of the months throughout this 30-year period, 1981 to 2010, for this non-disclosed station. As you can see here, for April, 500 millimeters falls below the maximum rainfall in that month over this period. And if you look to the graph on the right, you'll see that this time we've got 10th to 90th percentile. So here the information content is different. And stream 2, the group of people who were in stream 2 answered this question looking at this graph. And as you can see here, the 500 millimeter rainfall is above the 90th percentile, quite a lot above the 90th percentile. So during the survey, people were given this sliding bar, so they could change their answers according to the question and slide it from the left to the right. And for this particular question, they can move it from exceptionally unlikely all the way to virtually certain. And what I'm going to show you now is the histogram of responses to these particular questions based on stream 1 and stream 2, the people who looked at the left plot and the people who looked at the right plot. So here you can see the histogram of responses, or the frequency distribution of responses. The top plot here represents those who had the minimum maximum information, and the people, and the bottom plot is those who had the 10th to 90th rainfall information, percentile rainfall information. And as you can see, the distribution of responses is different between these two graphs, and that's why we can conclude that the information content matters for these types of questions. For the people who had the minimum and maximum information, the mean was actually around 20 to 25, where 50 is an equal likelihood. So people were moving it towards the unlikely side of the slider bar, but not quite as far as they did when they had the 10th to 90th percentile information. So we also investigated how people interpret different visualization styles and different visualization types. And this is one of the key results that we get, that is different ways of presenting data alter the climate change messages that people extract. So we had a number of visualizations that we compared, and those who were in stream 1 had a certain set of visualizations, and those in stream 2 had a different set of visualizations. And what we did is compared the responses between the two groups. So just a reminder of the figures that we use. This is figure A1, and this is showing the change in annual average rainfall from the past to the future period, 2041 to 2070. So these are two 30-year periods, and we're taking the anomaly or the change between these two periods, the change in the mean, for 10 models. And what we're showing here is the median and the minimum to maximum to range of those 10 models in this particular visualization style. Figure A2 is the same visualization with the same data, but this time we've just changed the axis, and this was just the one thing that we changed here. So we tried to change just one thing between each of the visualizations. Again, the title for each of these visualizations is exactly the same. So here for figure B1, we have crosses marked, so we have each of the individual 10 models, their rainfall anomalies from the past to the future. And figure B2, we have the same visualization, but this time, rather than to avoid that problem of overplotting, we have them jittered, so the ones that are close to each other are plotted next to each other. For figure C1, this is a slightly more novel type of visualization. This is actually looking at thresholds and models that are between particular thresholds. So, for example, there is one model here that's between drying of 200 millimeters to 250 millimeters. And then we change the orientation of this, so going from vertical to horizontal, to see how this affected how people both interpreted the data and their preferences. And then finally, on this particular style, data, we had these bars, which were in this case coloured red for drying and blue for wetting. And again, each bar represents one model here, so we have the 10 models from this data. And this time, for figure D2, so this is for stream 2, they didn't have the colour, so they were just given this grey colour instead of the red and the blue. We also had slightly more information content for another set of figures. Now these are perhaps the most complicated figures in the survey. So this is showing you the change in not only the mean rainfall, but also the minimum and maximum rainfall from the past and the future. So in the grey here we have for the 10 different models. So let's have a look at model 1 on the left. We have the minimum rainfall in that 30-year period of the past was around, that looks about 650 millimeters to around 2,100 millimeters for the maximum, and the mean is just over 1,200. And in the future, the minimum increases somewhat, the maximum decreases substantially, and the mean shows very little change for model number 1. And we have this for 10 different models. And this is with the minimum to maximum information for stream 1, but also the 10th and 90th percentile information for stream 2. for those 10 different models. But of course here we have the information about the change in the mean as an absolute rainfall from each model rather than the anomaly. So this is what we're interested in comparing. How do people interpret this versus the anomaly information? So after looking at each of these figures, they were asked a number of questions, and one of which was, how do you expect the average annual rainfall to change in the future? And again, they had the sliding bar, so they can move it left or right towards very likely to decrease or very likely to increase. Leaving it in the middle would be indicating no change in the future. Of course, this was a required question, so actually, in order to leave it in the middle, you had to initially move it and then move it back, which caused some confusion for some people, but in general, this wasn't a huge problem. So these are the histogram of responses with the sliding bar there, the scale to show you the scale of the x-axis there. And this is the histogram of responses for each of the streams. So these are two samples, two streams of people, and as we can see, there's a wide difference in how people respond to this question, with most people moving it slightly to the left or somewhat further to the left towards a decrease, a few people moving it toward an increase, and then some people leaving it in the middle there. On the left, I've also given you the mean of the sample. So for A1, the mean was 37.5. It's on a scale from 0 to 100, which the person completing the survey doesn't see, but this is the numbers I get from the data. And then for A2, we have a slightly increased or decreased mean, 36.2. But really, there isn't much of a difference between these distributions, between A1 and A2 here. So for B1 and B2, this time we actually get higher means, so 42.6 for B1 and 39.6 for B2. And as you can see, there's compared to the previous responses, there's less moving it towards a decrease. And actually these differences are statistically significantly different because we have a reasonable sample size, and so we can say that actually if you showed B1 rather than A1, then you get a higher on average result. So 42.6, that means less of a decrease, if that makes sense. So here we have the responses for these threshold plots. And in fact, C1 here, this showed a mean of 35.9, so a lot of people move this towards the decrease side. And then for D1 and D2, similarly we have results where the spread is towards the decrease side, but there's a great spread as well, going all the way from very likely to decrease all the way to near very likely to increase. Now for the other type of visualization, we could ask exactly the same question. Here we weren't showing anomalies, but we have the mean information for each of the models. And here you've got very different results, which are statistically significantly different at a very high level of confidence to the distributions from the other responses. So this is really showing that if you show anomaly information and don't contextualize that in the data, you can get very different responses. It perhaps also shows that when given people a more complicated graph, they're much less likely to move it to one of the extremes. So there was probably a mixture of responses here of people who perhaps didn't fully grasp what the plot was showing, but then also because it was not the anomalies, but you could see the actual means and the mean changes between the models, people thought there was less of a message here about climate change in the future. Perhaps one of the most interesting results that came out of the survey was related to how people express confidence in their ability to answer specific questions. So when asked the question, how do you expect the annual average rainfall to change in the future, we then proceeded to ask how confident they were in their previous answer. We found that confidence in answering this question is proportional to their assessed likelihood of change. What we have plotted here is confidence from not at all to extremely plotted against the expected change or their answer to that previous question. And the size of the circle here shows the number of respondents in this particular grouping. So for example, the smallest dots show one person answering at this particular expected change or confidence, and when we see a larger circle, this means more people answering in this particular answer. So what we can see is that those people who don't expect much of a change or expect a slight decrease are generally less confident than those who express or expect it to change more considerably. So those who push the slider towards very likely to decrease or possibly very likely to increase generally express a greater sense of confidence. And we can actually see this if we look at all all of the answers to the A, B, C, and D class visualizations as well. This pattern, this Y-shaped pattern, emerges in most of the responses. So clearly there's some real message here that those who are expecting a change either way, either a decrease or an increase, are generally more confident in their ability to extract messages from those particular visualizations and that data. In addition to the questions around interpretation, we also asked some very simple questions around which type of plots people preferred. And resoundingly, the result was that people preferred plot type D. So this here we're comparing A, B, C, and D, and especially when it contains color. So here again, we're looking at the different types of plots. So we've got A, B, C, and D for stream 1 here. And what you can see in the figure below is the way people ranked those models. They were asked to rank them from 1 to 4, so 1 being the best, 4 being the worst. And the means below each of the plots on the top there, so you can see below D it says x bar equals 1.46. This means that on average people rank this 1.46. So being close to 1 means that a lot of people ranked it first. And you can see in the frequency distribution below the proportion of people that actually ranked this plot first amongst these 4. So it's around 70% of people did that. C was the least popular, but B equally was not very popular. And A was the second most popular for a first choice. When we compare this to stream 2, as you can see here, the people who rank plot D as the first goes down to just below 60%, and B comes up much higher here, possibly because we're avoiding this problem of the overplotting which you get for stream 1. But here in C this time, no one ranked it first in this particular occasion, so this generally came out the worst in both streams. Possible reasons for preferring D rather than the others, and there's a whole host of reasons that we can only speculate on really, and this is one of the disadvantages of doing this for an online survey. So there was option to comment on it on every individual question, but really you want to do this in a workshop setting to find out what are the reasons people are choosing specific visualizations over others. But here's a list of possible possibilities. So we have familiarity, detail in the plot, clarity of the plot, aesthetic appeal, cognitive ease, which basically means how easy is it to interpret messages or read the data, least effort, if you like. Best of a bad bunch, so they may have disliked all of them and had to select one of them as their preferred option. And then equally D was the one they looked at last, so maybe this was the freshest in their mind, and therefore this was the one they preferred. And by comparing the two different streams, so the different groups of people who are responding to this survey, we can actually look at the differences, and some of those differences between the responses were statistically significant between the two streams, and here we're looking at the 95% confidence level. I'm just focusing on a few of these results, but this may be unsurprising, but it's quite interesting that it comes out as a difference. So when looking at these particular plots, B1 and B2, so one, we have this problem with overplotting, which is not a trivial problem when plotting data. It might be when we only have 10 models, it seems obvious, but when we're plotting maybe 100 pieces of data, we don't worry about overplotting, but this illustrates that perhaps we ought to. When asked about clarity, so how clear is this graph to interpret, the mean response, again from 0 to 100, 100 being very clear, 0 being completely unclear. The mean response to B1 was 52.5, whereas the mean response to B2 on the right there was 63.2. And this reflected also in the preference rank as well, so remember that 1 was a perfect, the best of the 4, and 4 was the worst of the 4 plots. So the plot on the left, B1, this came out 2.8 in preference rank, whereas the plot on the right came out 2.1, so close to the second ranked option. So clearly clarity is an important feature of how people like or prefer particular visualization styles. And here we're looking at C1 and C2, so this rather novel threshold concept. This was developed by, again, Susie Lorenz, who's looking at this in Leeds. And here we can see in the clarity that from the vertical orientation towards the horizontal orientation, the clarity goes down, so from 51 to 41.2. And the preference is reflected perhaps as a result of this. So whereas on the left there, C1, we have a preference close to 3, the preference here is 3.5, so this is on most people ranked this as their least preferred option. And then this also reflects in how likely they are to use this in their work. So people are much more likely to use the C1 rather than C2, although they're quite unlikely to use either of these. And then crucially, and I think this is a really interesting result, that this reflects in their trust of the underlying data. So they're asked, how would this visualization reflect the way you trust the underlying data? And the people who responded to C1 gave an average response of 51, whereas the response for C2 was 42.5. So not only does the way we visualize the data, just in terms of the style, and here in just in terms of the orientation, affect the way people interpret its clarity and the preference, but also it can affect the way we actually trust the underlying scientific data. We also had a look at some of the demographic and institutional variables and factors, and looked at how they related to users' preferences and interpretation of the information. And we did find some statistically significant relationships. And I haven't got time to go into all of the details, and again, if you're interested in this, then please do contact me. But here are some of the perhaps more interesting examples. So those who worked in government, national, provincial or local, were more likely to trust the underlying scientific data contained in their visualizations. Also, people who aren't fluent in English have more confidence in regional climate simulations. There was a question towards the end around how much you trust the results of regional climate visualizations. Interestingly, North Americans, so we had respondents from all over the world. Majority were focused their work on Africa, but we did have people who focused their work on Europe and North America and elsewhere. And they were more confident in their ability to calculate the 15% tip. This was one of the questions we asked early on when we were assessing, doing self-assessed numeracy. But also people who had the highest qualification as a master's degree were more confident in their ability to calculate 15% tip. So I'm not quite sure what that necessarily means. And interestingly, because one of the primary reasons for doing this survey was to look at the African impacts and adaptation community, we looked at what happens when you subsample for just those people who focus their work on Africa, and we found that on average the respondents expected a higher likelihood of decreasing rainfall when compared to the non-African focused respondents. In addition, the African focused respondents also were generally more confident in their assertions. So how can we conclude and determine what we've learned from doing this survey? So here are some tentative findings first, and these are findings that I'd really like to explore further, and I think they require more evidence, but there's tantalizing evidence within this survey to suggest that some of these assertions here might be true. And that's trust in the quality and reliability of climate data is related to the style, scientificness, and the familiarity of the presentation style. Also, the use of colour, particularly red and blue, which we examined here, is more aesthetically pleasing, and people commented on this. But it does influence how the user interprets the magnitude of change. This isn't particularly well evidenced in this survey, but it's something I'd like to explore, is when people see red or see blue, they're more likely to interpret a decrease or increase of rainfall. We see a hint of this when we compare the D1 to D2, the plot that had colour and didn't have colour, but really we need to explore this further to see how this really affects how people interpret and extract climate change messages. Many users did not fully understand the consequences and limitations of using anomaly information to interpret climate change messages, and some do not realise that climate models have different climates. And this really came across when we compared the results from A to D to those M1 and M2 plots, which had more information, but crucially each model had a different mean because they have different underlying climates in the different models. And I'm not sure everyone in the groups realised that this was indeed the case. And I think this is very important, not only when visualising climate information, but also when communicating anomaly information. So this is something that I'd definitely like to explore further. And then this is perhaps one of the most interesting results, that guidance information or findings is that guidance information on web-based portals is unlikely to provide much benefit for helping users to interpret figures. However, the title and axis of the graph are critically important. So here I'm really talking about the population example that we used, and we found very few differences, in fact no statistically significant differences between the groups who were given the population example first and those who weren't. Just some quick concluding comments. Firstly, the choice of information content in a visualization can significantly impact the interpretation of climate risks. Secondly, the style and aesthetic attributes of a visualization can influence the interpretation of climate change messages and affect preferences. Thirdly, people have very different views on what makes a good visualization. This came out both in the results, the quantitative results, but also in the comments that were throughout the survey. And then also, crucially, I think online surveys are limited. So we can only interpret so much from the answers. And it's very difficult to determine why people answer in a particular way, whether it's interpretation, misapprehension, or even selection errors as they're going through the survey. And then, as any researcher would say, I think further work is definitely needed. There's specific target questions that emerge out of this research, but I'd be very interested in working with anyone who wants to further this, and certainly people in our group at CSAG are interested in exploring these issues further. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you found some of the content interesting. Obviously, there are plenty of other results as well that I don't have time to share. So if you're interested in hearing more about the results or interested in the research, then please feel free to contact me at jdarren@csag.uct.ac.za.